Margaret and Chris, thank you for joining us.
Sure.
Having us.
Let's start with just a few high-level numbers to give the audience a sense of the size of the organization you run. Margaret, just give us a sense of the scope.
Well, Food Bank for New York City serves 1.5 million New Yorkers. That's 1 out of every 5 New Yorkers gets their food from a soup kitchen or food pantry. We have about 24 tractor-trailer trucks on the road every day. We deliver about 120 free meals every minute. Think about who is being sponsored and served by a food bank. Surprisingly, it is not who people always think. It's not just homeless people. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of the working poor. It is lots of seniors. It's almost 400,000 children, almost the same number of people who live in the city of Miami. Just children alone served by a food bank in this great city.
Wow, Chris?
WIN, which you might also know as Women in Need, we are the largest provider of shelter and services as well as supportive housing to homeless families in New York City. And let me just emphasize families for a second. You know, we have the highest level of people in shelter right now in New York City's history. 70% of them are families with children. 9 out of 10 of those headed by a woman. And we actually at WIN have started calling our families the forgotten face of homelessness. Because I think if you asked most people in this room and most New Yorkers, and honestly it was my perspective before this job, who's homeless, they're not going to say that number. We serve in our 11 shelters, on average 4,700 people a night, of which 40% are children 5 years of age or younger. So on average, about 2,500 to 2,700 children. In addition to our shelters, we presently have about 350 units of permanent supportive housing, but we're on the verge next year of opening a supportive housing building in Brooklyn, 161 units, and it will be the largest supportive housing development for homeless families in the country.
Wow. And we're reading a lot of headlines now about cuts coming out of Washington to budgets for organizations such as yourself. You're on the front lines, are we seeing the effects of that yet?
Well, we're not seeing it yet in the fact that the budget has yet to be approved, but what was submitted would be about $193 billion in cuts to food stamps over 10 years. That would be about 45 billion meals suddenly removed from the tables across the country for the most vulnerable families. I think that sometimes when people hear about different threats and the savings that we're going to have, when you attack a program, and I think it's important for urban decision makers, to always know how to go backwards and say, well, what do you mean by that? When you hear an attack against a food stamp and the welfare queen and the people who are, food stamps, it's an economic driver. It brings cash into your city. It actually probably impacts the person in need the least. It impacts jobs. How any leader would be able to basically say, I'm going to remove cash from our coffers and be okay and get to keep a job is a little unbelievable, but it happens because we are simply unaware. So there have been lots of attacks and hurts. I mean, there's recently an ABOD attack across the country where people, because if you don't have children, you're a single person, you lost money for food. You can't use these food stamps for anything else,
no,
but food. Thankfully, because we live in New York City, and we have great leadership, a great legacy of leadership in this city, by the way, our leaders blocked it. And they did a lot to be able to try to protect as many New Yorkers as possible, from our governor blocking major cuts that would have wiped out at a more food than Food Bank for New York City, the country's largest food bank, distributes in a year. It was going to take that much out of this city, but our governor stepped in. So the impacts, they happen in different ways. It's like we're not just waiting for that federal cut, but we know the road that they're attempting only because of where we've been over the past few years.
Gotcha. But you, Chris?
I just first want to comment on the picture on the screen. I mean, I hope this actually isn't a picture of a single shelter somewhere in New York City, but I just want to make clear, at WIN, And really most of the family shelters, I hope, the model is very different. People have individual rooms. Those rooms have kitchenettes, because learning to cook, have dinner with your family, cook healthy is very important. Private bathrooms, counseling spaces, recreation spaces. We have a camp all summer and every school break. So I just want to be clear, because some of our resistance, I believe, in communities to shelters comes from the bad old days model, which is a little bit like this. And it happened, but I just want to be clear. You know, I think everything Margaret said about the potential impact is real. And in the shelter system in New York City, of course, New York has a legal requirement to house the homeless. That court ruling doesn't say at what level or how well. Right now in New York City, half of all the money providers receive from the government to run shelter comes as a pass-through from the feds to the state. It's called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF. Could that all be gone? Could part of that be gone? We don't, as Margaret said, know yet even what the number enemy is, right, to target against. So what does that do? It creates confusion, anxiety, and fear, and potential misunderstanding. Poverty, by definition, and homelessness and hunger are conditions wrought with fear, anxiety, and instability. So the communities we're serving are probably the most vulnerable to the impact of these terribly mean actions that are being discussed in Washington. And I'll give you one example. It was around the holidays. We were very grateful to the Robin Hood Foundation. They were funding a gingerbread making event at our two biggest shelters in Brooklyn. And so I was theoretically helping the little ones make gingerbreads. Mostly I was stealing their candy. And some of the moms said, oh, you're Hillary's friend, because I had been on CNN. And I said, well, yes. I mean, it's not like Hillary and I go to the movies, but I was like, yes, and they're like, oh, would you tell her this? Would you tell her that? I was like, absolutely. And one of the little girls said, you know Hillary? I said, yes. And she said, Donald Trump's very bad. And I said, well, I have to agree with you, honey. You can't lie to the children. They'll see right through it. And she said, he's going to kick me out of shelter. Now, the child did not appear to be, an immigrant. Anyway, I said, well, honey, where were you born? She said, New York City. I said, well, first of all, nobody's getting kicked out of shelter. But you're an American citizen. You're not getting kicked out, and explain the situation to her. And she was adamant that he was going to kick her out of shelter. Because Donald Trump had said, she told me, you have to go back to where you came from. So where she came from may have been a father who beat her and her mother. It may have been sleeping in the bathtub in her aunt's house where there were 3 or 4 relatives. It may have been dangerous. That's the impact of this on the daily lives of people who are fighting so hard to break the cycle of homelessness. And honestly, the children absorb it the most. And that's why at Win, in part of our holistic way to win model, which we really think is a fundamental part of breaking that cycle, we have services specifically for children. The city kinds of funds us to only serve the head of household. So there isn't, our sense of family is the head of household, another adult if there is one, each child individually and collectively. Because homelessness, as I've said, is a trauma. We've learned painfully in this country what happens when you don't treat trauma. And that's why we need to expand in shelters, which sounds like, how can you be talking about Donald Trump, ruining the world and expanding? Because you have to, because that's what our kids need. A homeless child is twice as likely to be a homeless adult. We can't allow that to continue. Now, the other place I think we'll see the Trump impact already, and I would assume it's the same for you, in our board of directors. Because they're like, whoa, we have to wait, we have to see, we have to have a contingency plan. You can't have a contingency plan if it's really what, you know what I mean? So I worry about our clients, but I worry more about us becoming fearful ourselves as leaders or nonprofit leaders or corporate leaders. We can't allow that to happen because that's the first step of winning.
Absolutely.
Can I say, you said there's no contingency plan, but part of your job is to come up with a contingency plan. And,
Well,
what is the worst case scenario that you have to prepare for?
losing half of, so our government budget is about $80 million. Our budget is about $80 million, of which 85 to 88% comes from the government, of which half, in essence, comes from the federal government.
Yeah.
The worst case scenario is we could lose all of that. A more realistic scenario is we could lose a quarter, we could lose 10%, et cetera. Now, of course, you always have to plan. But we don't really know what the number is at the moment. And I kind of will be damned if I'll let the Trump shenanigans in the press and their leaks that they're also concerned about of what's in the budget cause us to contract when there's needs right in front of us. Now, as we know more, we'll fight it, as Margaret did so well, as she described. And then if we get to the point where there has to be a contingency, we will. Yeah. And what I'll do as the shelter provider in New York City is get some good lawyers to take us to court and say what the court case meant about level of service. Now, realistically, if the cuts are as significant as they could be, and we're just two examples of social services, there's others.
Sure.
Then what's going to happen, in my opinion, is civic leaders, not so different to what we saw with, Lou Rudin and others during the fiscal crisis, are going to have to step up beyond what they've done and make a commitment to sustaining the social service network in New York City. And I think as we heard the mayor of Phoenix speak in the prior panel, it's going to have to be about cities stepping up and make it happen. Now, I don't think that's going to be easy. Might there conversations of groups having to merge, et cetera, et cetera? Yes, but that all can happen, but we can't immediately leave our post, so to speak,
right,
and retreat.
Right.
Because I think it's comforting to hear, charities stepping up and stepping into the gap. Well, charities serve, that's what we do, but there's no way for any charity to replace government.
No.
That's just, sorry to break it to you. I mean, it is a feel-good moment when we all show up in the holidays and we have on our corporate T-shirts and we
Right.
serve together.
And even
and
our
it
big
is, and it's
dinners.
yes, and it's powerful and it's impactful to the bottom line, but that's an organizational bottom line, not about the impact of people in need. There's a reason why support for the most vulnerable is written into federal budget, state budget, local budget, because it's so many doggone people who are in fact vulnerable. And this is not someone else's problem.
Right.
The reality is when we look at the poorest in the city, when we look at who's turning to a soup kitchen and food pantry, by the way, by the time you've turned to a soup kitchen and food pantry, guys, you are at the end. You are at the end. There are no other options. We want people to go to the grocery store to feed their families. That's where dignity is. We don't want children, seniors, in soup kitchens and food pantries.
Right.
This is not a good thing. 60% of who we serve are women. And a woman becomes more vulnerable as she ages. So let's be clear, this is important to everyone. In a city where, let's look at Brooklyn, where the rent
Yep.
takes up 65% of your income, when the national average is 30. This is everyone's problem. We can't just be grateful, glad I got grandma's apartment or whatever it is that is your situation. Glad I live in Connecticut. The reality is
You don't hear
this
that a
can't-
lot from my clients. I mean, never have we heard. I'm so happy I can go to Greenwich, never. But God bless.
But it's a very real thing for so many working
Yep.
poor that we cannot rest on our laurels and believe that there is a bomb. At the end of the day, the bomb in this city is called New Yorkers. We actually get more traction if one of our donors picks up the phone and calls an elected official, calls a government entity, than me and 500 soup kitchens. By the way, I serve 1,000 charities. We serve 1,000 charities. And you get more movement if one of our donors picks up a phone or writes a letter, because it's the shock factor. Whoa, why are you asking about this? Game changer.
One of the things I just want to add that in addition to all the eloquent things Margaret just said is we need to remember that our work is also not, and this is a trite phrase you hear all the time, is about eventually, decreasing the need for us. Some say put us out of business, but I think that's probably not the right long-term vision. And what does that mean? In part, it means, making sure we sustain these funds and money, but it also makes sure that we see ourselves not as kind of, I went to 12 years of Catholic school, so I can say this, the nuns of old, right? We're not running, the orphanages that the nuns used to run, right? We're running, God bless them, and sister, I didn't say anything bad about you, and hopefully I won't go to hell now, but we're running institutions that are and need to be more data-driven, analytic, evidence-based practices, trauma-informed care. Because at Win, our goal is to break the cycle of homelessness. And the city judges itself by how many people are in shelter. Right now, we have the highest ever. They'll think they're a success if next month in the numbers we're below X. It's irrelevant. The definition of solving the problem as it relates to homelessness is having people not return, right? That's the answer. And how do you have people not return? You make sure that the shelters are not ever reduced to, as my father would say, 3 hots and a cot. That's not going to solve the problem. 51% of Win's moms are working, but they can't make the rent. That's why mostly with private funds, we at Win have an income building program where we saw almost 3,500 income gains, employment gains last year for our Win's mothers. So we need to recognize this, all of you recognize this, we're talking about this, we're not talking about necessarily charity and the old-time vision of charity. This is, and we're announcing today, and I'm very grateful to Jonathan Choloff, who's here, and the CUSP at NYU, a strategic partnership with them to raise Win's ability to use data to define what is successful and what isn't, and make the Win network the first smart shelter network in the country, and hopefully we'll be able to get that replicated. I think that's important, and I know Margaret's organization could speak to that too, so people just don't think there's kind of an acquiescence in this service work. There's not. No.
Just one more question, then we'll go to the audience. But in this political environment, are you seeing people stepping up more, that the philanthropic community says, boy, these people need our help more than ever? Are you seeing that at all?
Absolutely. Thankfully, we are in a city that's very compassionate, and people don't just experience that through just individual. People take it to work with them as well. Food Bank has been around for 34 years, and it took us, we're now at 30 years to get our first 7-figure giver. We now have 2 of them as individuals. Some people say, what, are you kidding? But for New York City, where every arts organization has several of them, it's a really big deal for a food bank to reach that part. Yeah. We also are seeing more giving based on kind of tangible storytelling of people at lower levels. More of the young professionals are involved. We have our very first junior board, and a food bank with a junior board. That just was not something that was ever even thought of before, but we needed a new way to engage some of these great, brilliant minds from Google and Tumblr and Morgan Stanley, and they are amazing. We're also seeing that more companies are getting away from just, they'll do the traditional giving, but we've now been doing more customized services. Like, we now have corporations wanting to bring services into their building so that more people can participate because it's being requested by their employees. We actually just repacked thousands of pounds of food in Times Square. Never thought that was going to happen. They have to pay for that. That's not free. That is not free, but it's a wonderful experience.
I said, did Elmo help?
Yeah, exactly.
Elmo did not pay, therefore no.
And you always have to tip.
Those pervy Elmos, you don't want to trust them ever, so.
I'm not going to comment. Are you seeing this?
I may be slightly, I'm Irish, more of a Debbie Downer than Margaret. I think, we're experiencing great generosity from the philanthropic community. That said, we've expanded our focus in that area, so I can't, chicken or egg, I don't know. That said, it's all good in that people get it, that they have to give. I'm not yet seeing the kind of infrastructure of coordination from leaders at the top yet. Now, I'm not criticizing anybody about that, because as we said before, we don't know what's what. And there's some level of hope that the Trump administration is so incompetent that maybe they'll just re-up last year's budget, you know what I mean? So no, but that doesn't mean I don't think we will. But I do want to say the volunteer, which is no joke helpful.
amazing.
I mean, about a third of all of our programming and income building comes from volunteers, you know, corporate people who are going to do financial literacy, et cetera, et cetera. That's genuine, and to me, that's, you know, as exciting as the top folks coming forward, because
Absolutely.
it shows there's going to be grassroots pressure up and people who are going to actually put bodies out there.
And the support will stay longer.
Correct.
The support will stay longer.
Correct.
Love to get a couple of questions from the audience.
Hi, Bill Matsakudis. Do you think that there's a conflict between taking funds and putting them toward shelters versus permanent housing? You know, I was part of putting together a white paper as part of basically a campaign, and we were talking about the need for shelters across the river in Jersey City. And someone who's social worker and specializes in advocating for the homeless said, that's not the best place to put the funds. You should be putting the funds in permanent housing. And in fact, New York City has seen over the last 10 years, there's been studies that focusing on shelters may not be the best answer. It's more about permanent. So I'd like to get your feedback on
Right,
it.
well, first of all, the last part of your statement that New York City has focused in shelters over, I think you said the last 10 years, is that right? Is it not true? I mean, it's simply incorrect. And in fact, but let me go back to the overall question. Is affordable housing, which we do not have in New York City, and let me make clear, the mayor's affordable housing plan, which is, you know, I'm very grateful for, there is not one income band in that plan that my clients qualify for. They're too poor. So yes, we need affordable housing. And yes, we need more supportive housing, which is affordable housing with services on site. Only 30 to 40% of homeless families will only be able to live permanently independently with those services. I think, and this is not directed at you, but you'll hear from neighborhoods, oh, we don't need a shelter, we need permanent housing. Well, if you can't, okay, let's build some permanent housing right here. Okay, boom, we're done. You know, we're not bewitched. I can't wiggle my nose and get housing to be built, one.
Exactly.
So that takes time. And then nobody wants affordable housing in their neighborhood because it's going to be too big, too tall, and then they don't want them either. So let's be clear about that. 3, shelter is not the problem. And we've become to define shelter as the problem. The problems are the conditions that brought people to extreme poverty, hunger, and homelessness. And the problem is the impact and traumatic impact of that on people's lives. So shelter is actually, as transitional housing is what we call it, a necessary part of the process to get people restabilized so they can live permanently and independently. And we need the door, let me be clear though, the door out of shelter is not wide enough because those options aren't out there. But what actually happened in New York City in the first 3 years of the de Blasio administration and the end of the Bloomberg administration, we didn't really open a lot of shelters. Mayor de Blasio had a moratorium on them. People don't go away. So what we saw skyrocket was families placed in hotels. Hotels have a minimum level of services, maybe half a social worker, no security. And we saw last year a woman murdered. She was there with her child in a hotel by her batterer. So in not taking the political leap and demonstrating the political guts that Mayor de Blasio did demonstrate this winter in saying we would build 90 new shelters, we ignored the problem and in fact let it fester and spread into inappropriate transitional housing, which is only going to create the revolving door in and out. So it's about a comprehensive plan, and that has different points to it.
And even though, was it Bill? Even though Bill asked this question, I think for everyone in this room, urban planners, urban decision makers, listen, we have to be smart and we have to be thoughtful, but we don't want to be so analytical and so thoughtful that we are not good for anything. Right. That's a real concern. I'm very serious. We can't be blind to the level of hurt that's happening in this city right now. In Hunts Point, South Bronx, which in a little bit you know is going to have
please.
fabulous condos, but for today, the majority of those apartments, which could be affordable housing, they're not. The entire neighborhood, shelters. Every single
that's
one
not
of those
good
apartments.
either, right?
No,
That's the problem.
no. But at the end of the day, they're shelters because these people have nowhere to go. They have nowhere to go. Yes, the problem is the folks on the streets because you see them. But it is also a problem for the families in three-quarter housing where they are splitting one apartment, one restroom, one bathroom, 3-4 families in that one place. That's a problem too. Just because we don't see it walking up and down Times Square does not make it not a huge problem.
Want to amplify a word Margaret used, plan. We look at problems like poverty, homelessness, and hunger as things we can wish away, right, with a can of soup at the holidays. These are problems that are part of our city, part of the cities of America, and urban places too, but from the cities of America. If we want to reduce them, and hopefully someday eliminate them, but let's just focus on reduce them now, we need to treat them with the same level of respect and laser-like focus that government treats other problems. I applaud the mayor of Phoenix for making his permit time so low. I'm incredibly jealous as a former government official, but that's an intent, that's a focus.
Absolutely.
That we've not historically seen in any city be brought to these issues, which will not go away because people say a prayer, drop off a coat, and a can of soup.
Great, let's get one more question.
One more? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, hey.
Do you ever wish you had Robert Moses to help you get a plan like that accomplished?
Robert Moses is my father's favorite person right after FDR, which says to you a lot about my father. I'm not really sure. I don't know how well me and Mr. Moses would have gotten along. It might have been a clash of strong opinions. No, but there is something to be said about the Robert Moses or FDR look at things. They saw solutions and they implemented them. And a lot of people didn't like their solutions. Now, FDR's were all without a question right and correct and save the country. You can't say that about Robert Moses. But I do think if you look at somebody like Moses, he had a spine, he drove it through. I would argue most for not good results. What did FDR have? He had a spine and he drove it through. That's kind of the leadership we want now. And this was not what Bill was saying, but neighbors will always say, I don't want that, I want this. And then when they get this, I don't want that, I want this. We have to all stand up at some point and say, this is a problem. Those 60,000 people are New Yorkers, and if you want to vote against me, if you want to throw tomatoes at me, that's fine. I don't really give a shit. And that's what we need a little more of in this thoughtful, analytic, strategic plan, is elected officials just not giving a shit about the opposition.
And even though the leaders may be different, the conditions are still very similar. Free lunch came because those leaders realized it was an issue of defense. If people were too weak, they couldn't go into the military, they couldn't protect the country. That's the truth. Right now, in the poorest neighborhoods, they're not just poor, it also has the highest incidence of preventable disease. It's not a thing we can wait on because people in these poorest neighborhoods are 9 times more likely to die of a disease that a little bit of vegetables could have cured. That's the truth. So listen,
And that's
There
a
are no-
fixable
there's no-
problem.
absolutely.
That's not curing
Listen.
cancer. That's a fixable problem.
Lady Liberty is our mascot in this city for a reason. Strong women and men who love strong women, get it together. Because right now, there is nobody coming on the white horse.
No.
It's us. We have to say what is okay for this city that we love and what is not okay for this city and country that we love. And it's as simple as that.
And it really also is, I just want to say again, not to sound like a broken record, It's about a plan. It's about elevating this to infrastructure plans, road repairs, you know, well, I'm not going to say school building because that's not happening either, but you know what I mean. You get my point.
Right. Thank you to both.
Thank you,
Powerful
guys.
conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna take a picture of this.